basics. General Conference, as a reminder, is the typically every 4-year gathering of delegates from all over the world throughout any place where there is a United Methodist Witness, and even some places that actually only have Methodist partner churches send delegates to one place where we gather for about 11 days, and we do the legislative work of the church. And so it is not entirely unlike the state legislature, right?
Yeah, like a tiny little mini special session, right?
Yes, that's a good way of describing it. So we gather together, we do committee work. We're gathered and split into legislative committees. And we work on petitions, like bills, pieces of legislation, changes people want to make to the Book of Discipline. We spend an inordinate amount of time, wordsmithing those and trying to perfect them, the ones that should come forward, and shoving to the side the ones that just need to die. And then we bring them back together for the plenary session to all together to vote to pass or not to pass. In the midst of all of that, we worship and we fellowship, and we do churchy things. So what more would you add about just the general?
Oh, just a reminder that the petitions come from all kinds of United Methodist people. Individuals are allowed to submit petitions. Annual conferences sometimes submit petitions that have been passed there. The general agencies also often have a lot of legislation, or there are also special study committees established that bring things forward. So it is always a big mix of places where the legislation comes from. That was even more true this year because we had everything for 2020, and then we had to open that back up and continue to receive legislation for another 2 years.
So altogether, there were about 1,100 petitions that were considered by the body. Not all of them made it to the plenary session. Most of them did not. But it's a lot of that kind of work. It's a lot of detail work for sure. I will also say, so because of the delay, right, this was the 2020 General Conference. So we were elected to serve as delegates in 2019. Okay, so if you remember, February of 2019 was the terrible called session of General Conference in St. Louis, where the traditional plan was passed, and there was just a lot of pain coming out of that session, and a great kind of wave of anger and disgust about what happened that February really rolled through the U.S. in particular as we were headed into annual conference sessions in June. And that meant that a huge wave of more centrist and progressive delegates was elected as delegates to this 2020 General Conference. We were part of that.
Yeah, and our Rio, Texas conference, just for context, we have 4 clergy delegates and 4 lay delegates to the General Conference this time. When I was elected, I wasn't a member of First Church. I was a member at Tarrytown, so I actually didn't know Taylor that well when we were elected, and then we were roommates for 2 weeks.
Together for
yeah,
2
now
weeks.
we've lived together. So
in very, very close quarters.
Yeah, but I will say for us personally, the Rio, Texas, this is the first delegation of the Rio, Texas Conference. So in the past, even in 2016, though we had completed our unification, we had a legacy of cooperative work between the former Rio Grande Conference and the former Southwest Texas Conference. So this was a big deal for us to do that work together, and it is probably the youngest and most diverse delegation, obviously of the Rio Texas Conference, but of our parent conferences too, and that really is in response to what happened in 2019.
And I think a lot of other delegations shared a similar story where it was there were just a lot of new delegates, whereas Previously, it's sort of a badge of honor, like how many general conferences have you been a delegate to? And people have been going for generations, the same people. And so this was really a wave of a lot of new people. At one point, somebody remarked when our delegation had dinner one night that this was the first general conference that they had been to where they didn't have to kind of fight their way through a crowd of protesters in order to get into the session, to the plenary floor. And I said, well, I think that's because most of the protesters got elected this time as delegates. And it's a joke,
That's true.
but it's not
Yeah.
untrue. It really was a very, very different body of people. So should we jump into the actual meat of kind of what legislation was passed? You want to pick something to start with?
Sure. So,
Oh, no. Let's see. Oh, I think she did. Okay. Oh. Okay. I will start with, thanks, Will. If there aren't any in the ushers room, they would be in the office. So regionalization is really the biggest and probably will end up being the most singularly impactful piece or group of legislation. So what that is about is governance. Basically, we are a worldwide church, and I forgot to mention, about 750 delegates and several thousand over the 2 weeks, several thousand observers and alternates and those sorts of things gathered in one of those, like I said, an underground bunker, a large convention center, with a wall of booths for translators. And so each of us has a headset because they are translating into 10 different languages throughout the conference. And so it really, in a way, it feels like the UN, an incredible undertaking just to make the thing happen in a way that is trying, at least, to bring equity to all the voices in the room, we're trying to move away from being a colonial church, a church that is centered in America and then has branches elsewhere that really are still sort of controlled by the American church. And so that's really at the heart of regionalization. This is, like I said, several different pieces of legislation, different petitions that all kind of hang together in order to change the structure of the church from kind of this hub in America with spokes off in all other parts of the world. And the spokes have had autonomy to make decisions that make sense for their context. They can change many, many parts of the Book of Discipline in order to fit. For instance, the educational requirements of clergy are not the same here as they are in Africa, right? Because you have different educational systems in the first place. So they have had the autonomy to make changes, but in order for anything to change in the United States, it has had to be voted on by the entire General Conference. So people from all over the world are voting on the clergy pension for the U.S. clergy, and voting on, just even the most minute details. If it happens in the U.S., it has required the entire church to vote on it. Everyone doesn't like that. No one likes it, because everyone from everywhere else is sitting there going, why are we spending days talking about things and voting on things that do not pertain to us? We don't understand it. We don't know why we're wasting our time and money doing it. It's just been a spider caught in its own web. Regionalization restructures the church so that the U.S. becomes a region, one of 4 regions. So there's the U.S., there's Africa, there's Europe, and there's the Philippines. And so those 4 regions then have autonomy to govern themselves in ways that are fitting for their context. But we still hang together in a global mission, right? So the regional governance enables us to stick together as a worldwide church by our mission. Does that make sense? Rachel, now that you're back to life.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about like
Sure.
the constitutional amendments related to that?
Sure. So that's big work, right? Restructuring the global church is big work. And the United Methodist Church has a polity structure that's not unlike the United States government. So we have a constitution, and this regionalization work requires constitutional amendments to sort of change the sorts of categories that Taylor was describing. There were 8 constitutional amendments related to regionalization. Some of you who are Methodist nerds and were watching along or following along will note that the first 4 were passed on a consent calendar and like the first day of the plenary session, and that's really when we knew, oh, this is going to be different than it has been before. But what that means is that those 8 pieces of legislation required not just a majority, but a 2/3 majority vote within the General Conference. And then, in order for them to be ratified, they require a 2/3 majority vote from the total votes cast by annual conferences and central conferences when those votes are taken over the next year. So we proceed, honestly, as if these changes to the church are going to be the way things are going forward. But at least for us in the U.S., we know that for our delegation, a big piece of work for the delegation going into 2025 is to prepare our own annual conference to understand the constitutional amendments before them, to understand the regionalization implications, and hopefully to vote at a pretty high margin for those amendments so that ratification can happen. Because we met just a few weeks ago, that all of those constitutional amendments will not be, none of them will be before annual conferences that meet in the next month. It's just not possible. So it will be in 2025 that those votes are taken. Is that?
You are welcome to.
Oh, I was just trying to think of like other things that those, like, there has been work over time to try to make this shift already. There is a lot of hope that it does decolonize the church in ways that are meaningful for the whole worldwide church. And it does mean also that we will continue to share, however, I think you said this, but things like there are our theological task as United Methodists is something that we will continue to hold together. So that the ability to shift and change is much more related, as Taylor said, to things like educational requirements. And it will also hopefully shift the nature of the General Conference itself, right? So much of the time is spent talking about, as Taylor said, things like U.S. pensions, when we could be talking about things like, what does the United Methodist Church, which has a global presence around the world, want to say and do about climate change, right? Like, how do we manage that conversation in a room full of people who are experiencing it in all different ways and places? And what witness can the church have for that? And we just don't get to spend our time that way because we spend it typically in policy matters that mostly affect the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the gist of regionalization. Like I said, I mean, that's a huge, huge lift. And it has been years and years of work for the people who brought it to us. And so that was a major deal. Then the next really big piece was the removal of harmful language, language that is harmful to the LGBTQ plus community. So this was, there were actually three priorities: regionalization, removal of harmful language, and the revised social principles that were priorities of a really large coalition of centrist and progressive groups. So lots of different groups that involve people like Reconciling Ministries Network, RMN. Some of you have been on the email list for Mainstream UMC out of Kansas. Lots and lots of other groups that kind of all banded together and said, we want basically the same. We're focused on a few key issues, a few key items, and we need to work together in order to make sure that these things happen and don't get just sort of left on the cutting room floor. And so regionalization was the first of those, and then removal of the harmful language was the second. And you kind of heard a little bit about that last week, but that certainly was included everything from repealing the plan that was passed in 2019 that really put teeth on punishing people who did same-sex weddings, or on clergy who made it through, LGBTQ clergy who made it through, or the boards that passed them, bishops who were sort of harboring people who were not supposed to be there. And so it repealed that plan. We removed the kind of what you call the legacy language of things like the two places in the discipline that say that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, making sure that stuff gets struck through. Removing the ban on giving money to any causes, any efforts that support LGBTQ plus people. Removing the ban on LGBTQ people being ordained, and on same-sex weddings happening in our churches or presided by our clergy. All of that basically that ground was leveled. It was just cleared out. So anything that was harmful was removed. It was not replaced by like super affirming language. And that was a strategic choice that coalition made together. And not everybody agreed with it. It was a compromise, basically, to say it is worth it to get to level ground and to be able to prioritize the regionalization work, because we need all the other parts of the world where affirming language is just not going to fly. We need their help to get regionalization to happen. And so we've got to be willing to give and take, basically, and say, okay, we need to get this far, at least, on the removal of harmful language, but we don't need to push further than that right now. We can wait until the U.S. region is able to gather and to make those changes at a more regional level.
Yeah, and I think in a positive way, while that's difficult for some of us who want to move inclusion into a more positive, affirming place in the life of the church, it is part of our overall understanding of intersectionality and inclusion to say we adopted that strategy in part so that we were not using this time when the U.S. had a particular majority to impose that on other regions of the world, and that in fact we mean it when we say we believe that regionalization will provide some autonomy for cultural context, and that we can allow that space. I think it provides some, not teeth, but a sense that we really meant it when we said we want there to be a decolonizing effect of regionalization.
And my observation was that felt true again and again and again. You could see the compromise happening, and you could see that there's still tension in the body. So when there were conversations about the social principles that involved language about marriage, you've certainly got a whole lot of people in that room who would really like to change the language in such a way that it is actually affirming same-sex marriage. But then you've got folks in the room who are actually uncomfortable with it not saying marriage is between a man and a woman, right? So you have both poles present in the room, but you also have many of those who even sort of live in those places who are willing to compromise, not strong arm the conversation, not sort of take everything we can get, winner take all kind of a situation. A willingness to listen, to be understanding, to not to listen charitably, I would say, to one another. I just found that to be present in the legislative committee and on the plenary floor as well. Not, we're not perfect. We were not perfect, but it was palpably different the way the conversation happened. So, what else? What else do you want to look up? There's the revised social principles, which kind of encompasses the same, but beyond. So that I think is a piece of work that we will be unfolding here. That's worth your class doing a study on the new set of social principles. Basically, they're just updated for the problems the world is now facing, which are not all different, but there is some nuance to how we think about them and how we ground ourselves theologically and biblically in our response to all of the things of being a part of the world. So, so that was an important piece as well.
I mean, I guess I would say one of the ways I've described it is that in the past, it's been our kind of understanding of how our faith meets social justice or our ideology, where the angst of the General Conference has kind of come forward. And that was very different. This was not the same as the old way, but if there was like some real angst among the General Conference or anxiety, it is that the truth is we are a smaller church than we were 8 years ago, or in 2019 for that matter, so 5 years ago. It is true that disaffiliation has changed the makeup of the denomination, and we've lost about 25% of churches. I always have to be careful about whether that's churches or members. 25% of churches. That's reflected in global budgets. We'll take questions in a second, Andrew. That's reflected in a budget that is the same size that the General Conference budget was in 1984. It was about a 43% decrease. And, we've felt this before. When you are decreasing a budget at that size, you're not just talking about trimming the extra things that have gotten added over time. You're talking about ministry and function and people. And that's hard. It's hard to come to terms with that change. It's not all bad, but if there was any sort of angst and anxiety, it was over the realization that some of the things that we are used to being able to do or provide or even add to the budget on the floor were not things that we could really do at this time. So like in 2016, from the floor, there was a provision, or maybe it was 2012, where people said, a young clergy initiative is really important and we want to add to the budget. And they made an amendment on the floor and added to the total budget and to the total apportionments for that. That kind of thing was not really possible in a budget where we were already asking our general agencies to cut their budgets by 50%, for instance. There is an ongoing challenge of what that will mean for Episcopal leadership into the future. But that's a lot about how will our institution function? And it's fair for us to be asking those questions. It's right for the General Conference to have some anxiety about that and to be struggling with it. To me, it's the fact that that was true did not take away from the reality that the things that have caused us to struggle and stumble before as a church were really different. And so it still didn't feel the same even at the most tense points of those conversations.
As part of that reduction in the budget, of course, that comes with we passed a lower rate of apportionments, and so we can anticipate that our apportionments to the general church will go down as long as the conference doesn't absorb all of the reduction that the general conference made, which I don't anticipate, but that was part of that as well, was just a debate of, it really is sort of, what does the local church need, and then what does the local church need to provide for the larger body of the church, the work that we are better able to do together than any one single local church is able to do on their own. So one other big thing that are you ready to move on?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to lift up that it was a really big deal that ordained deacons, so that's Kathy, and that eventually will be Becca and John Hathaway as well. Ordained deacons were given sacramental authority. So previously, deacons have not been permitted in most cases to preside at Holy Communion and to do baptisms. They can be given that permission by their bishop currently, but now, because of the General Conference vote, starting January 1st, theoretically, they will be allowed to do that within their setting of ministry, within their appointment. And so that's a huge change that we honestly are still sort of figuring out, like, okay, what does that mean? How does that work? How do we theologically kind of articulate why we're doing that and what it should look like? And so you can anticipate that likely will mean some change right here on the ground in the way that we exercise ministry among the clergy at First Church. So that's a big deal. A couple of other quick things, and then I think we'll take questions. One is that we voted to enter into full communion with the Episcopal Church of the USA. And so that's an agreement that we currently share with the ELCA. That's my husband's denomination, thank goodness. We can live in the same house. And then the Moravian Church as well. We're in full communion with them as well. And so now, once the Episcopals vote on it in July, I think it's in July that they meet, then we will be in that relationship with them as well. And that's the kind of moniker for that is Pulpit and Table Fellowship. Essentially, that clergy, United Methodist clergy, could be appointed to serve in an Episcopal church and vice versa. I would be able to preside at the table at an Episcopal church, and they would be able to preside at the table here with kind of without batting an eye, right? So that is a wonderful thing. And then there were just some other kind of great firsts. This is the time when we kind of flip the page and leadership of our Council of Bishops turns over, and our new president of the Council of Bishops is the bishop in East Ohio. Excuse me. Bishop Tracy Smith Malone is the first African American female president of the Council of Bishops. So that's a great thing. In addition, Bishop David Wilson, who presides in the Great Plains area, Kansas and Nebraska, was elected a couple of years ago when we were at jurisdictional conference, and he is the first Native American bishop in the church. And so it was a great day for him to preach and to preside over the business session of the General Conference. Just some of those kinds of ways that we're just seeing things changing. It really overall felt to me like and maybe it feels different because I was a delegate for the first time, but we always come away from General Conference kind of going, well, what did they actually do? And this actually, at times, Rachel and I had conversations where we were like, if we're not careful, we're actually going to do more than we can handle at once. There's going to be more change than the church is able to really manage all at one time. And so we definitely are not coming away feeling like, well, what did we actually do? What did we use all that time for? It felt fruitful. So any last thoughts before we ask for questions?
No, I think we're ready.
Okay. Andrew.
Not on our church's website, but the United Methodist website. This could be too, like attendance and stuff like that, like they'll talk about. It says that our church's attendance was 727. Is that accurate? Or is that an old number?
No, I just noticed.
Sure,
I will.
yeah,
I will.
yeah,
I will.
yeah.
I just noticed the same thing yesterday, and I thought, oh, I think that's maybe from around like the early 2000s. When you look up churches, he's asking about whether the numbers are accurate when you look up our church on the United Methodist Church website, and whether our attendance numbers that are reflected there are true. They are not. No. The answer is no. Those are old.
And then another question, I'll try to clarify. It'll help others clarify as well. Is like, I'm still kind of confused about how like the deacon process works. So I know that officially, Kathy and Brad are the associate pastors. Obviously, come July will just be Kathy. But I know that Becca and John have been involved in the church as well. So I'm just
Yeah.
the process how they fit in.
So Andrew's asking about deacons, and knowing that we've got deacons who are involved in the life of the church in a variety of ways, from Kathy being an associate pastor to church members who are on their way to being ordained deacons, and kind of everywhere in between. And that really is the nature of the deacon. Deacons in our church are they are ordained clergy, so they are clergy every bit as much as an ordained elder who's a senior pastor of a church. So in that way, we share that, but their call tends to be to bridge the church and the world. And so you'll find more deacons who are ordained, but they are practicing ministry outside the walls of the church. So they may be working in nonprofit organizations or in other kind of ministries that are outside the walls of the church. Many also work within the church itself, like Pastor Kathy, but their work is meant to be different. It's meant to be an extension of the church into the world, drawing the church out into ministry in the world. So that's the distinction. Okay, Patricia.
You mentioned the different regions, but South America was in. Why isn't that considered Methodist there?
Most of the, there are Methodists there. There
I'm
are,
going to repeat the question.
oh yeah, sorry. So Patricia asked about the worldwide regional bodies of the church, and that there wasn't a mention of Central and South America in that. And so are there not Methodists in those regions? There are Methodists in those regions. There are even United Methodists in those regions. However, many of those places, Mexico is a great example. I know that's not South America, but Mexico has an autonomous Methodist denomination. So a lot of, and I know Honduras does, a lot of countries in Central and South America have a Methodist or Wesleyan denomination, but it's tied to it's autonomous, it's not United Methodist. So like the British Methodist Church as well, we do have a region in Europe for the United Methodist Church, but the British Methodist Church is an autonomous Methodist expression, and so we relate a little bit differently. That said, there's often a lot of representation at General Conference from those autonomous but kind of cousin churches, because we do share a lot of our theological understanding, and we often share resources or seminary support, etc. So it's just true that for whatever reason, as the church was built there, it has been more autonomous. And we also saw that, that's what's happened to the Baltic and Russian Methodist churches, that we voted at General Conference to allow it to form an autonomous Methodist church in Eurasia.
So yeah, Russia,
Ukraine, some of
a
the
little bit of
yeah,
little pieces
Estonia,
of,
yeah.
surrounding countries, yeah. Sandy Wilder. She said, I know the Global Methodist Church was there. What was that like? I'm glad that you asked that because I do want to say that there's been some conversation where people heard the initial, it was the first sermon of the General Conference by Bishop Bickerton, who was the outgoing president of the Council of Bishops. He's in New York. And he was animated and very, very firm in, I didn't write down his actual words, but you probably remember better than I do, but he was very clear in saying, like, if you are here to disrupt what is happening here, then get out, basically. And I mean, it
Yeah.
was about that strong. I mean, I actually leaned over to Rachel and I was like, I hope he knows what he's doing, because it felt very just strong. And so I would say we began with a sense of kind of, a little bit of suspicion, not knowing what was going to happen. Are the people who are here, who have disaffiliated from the United Methodist Church, going to try to railroad the things that the greater church body wants to see moving forward? Is there going to be sabotage, basically, was kind of the fear. And as time went on, that just didn't seem to be the case.
It certainly didn't materialize on the floor. Like, I won't say that there weren't leaders we might recognize from the global Methodist movement or from the confessing movement that were there, and they were meeting with people, but ultimately they weren't many in number.
They certainly didn't have enough support to change the direction
Yeah.
that the conference was going.
Their
So-
influence was, I think early on it became clear their influence was not going to be great, and it did sort of feel like over the course of the week or the 10 days, they also began to kind of understand that and
There weren't.
back away a little bit.
I mean, we didn't even
Yeah.
see the Westboro Baptist Church. They weren't there
Yeah.
to protest.
Yeah.
Honestly, there was just sort of not a counter. There was one, I'm aware of one kind of, not protest, but like a gathering of folks who were really upset about not having language about marriage being between a man and a woman. And sort of making a big splash about that and making sure there was publicity about that. And that was really the only kind of show of like presence that I saw in any significant way. So honestly, pretty insignificant. I think, the way that they have spun the narrative is unique to them since then. And so if you get the emails, I get the emails because I'm interested, but if you get the emails from any of those groups, then it definitely, they make it sound like everything was just railroaded through and the progressives have taken over and it's just bedlam,
Yeah, and I think in the first week, part of where we did see some of that anxiety bubbling up was in questioning why there were so many, particularly African Central Conference delegates, who did not make it to the General Conference. There was some pretty significant questioning that was coming out of the more conservative part of the church, but I think, part of what changed the trajectory even of that conversation is that the centrist progressives were like, yeah, we'll stand with you and ask why is that the case? And we got some pretty, it was actually from centrist progressives who pushed and pushed and pushed to finally get a more comprehensive reporting of why that might have been the case in slightly higher numbers than is typical for a general conference. And the answer wasn't because the office of the general conference was trying to rig the thing. There were some really complex reasons that would be the case.
Yeah, they gave a really thorough explanation to that, which I found at one point. I can share that, but yeah. Other questions? Mm-hmm.
An example of a theological belief that all of the regions would have
Well, so she asked what's an example of a theological belief that all of the regions would have in common. Really, the whole front part of our book of discipline is shared. So all of the articles of religion and our theological task, what we believe, the basics of what we believe about God and about what the church is and what the church is meant for, about Jesus and about the Holy, like the basic theology is basically shared among the entire church. So it really is, like I said, it's our theology is still holding the whole worldwide connection together. It's governance that is split now between the regions. So others, yeah. Sue.
So this all has to be approved by supermajority of annual
So she asked, so this all has to be approved by a supermajority of annual conferences. Do you want to go back and clarify that?
Sure. So the language, the removal of the harmful language has been approved. That's done. And that doesn't have to be then ratified by annual conferences. That's, the General Conference had the authority to do that on its own, and that's done. In terms of the pieces of long-term regionalization that would allow for greater regional autonomy, that's where there are the 8 constitutional amendments that would make that a reality going forward, and those do have to be approved by a supermajority of all the people who vote. It's confusing. It's not annual, it's not each annual conference.
Yeah, it's not like you have to have 2/3 of our annual conference
Conference.
and 2/3 of North Texas and 2/3 of Texas conference. And you don't have to have 2/3 of each. You have to, they take the total number of people who voted all over the world, and you have to have 2/3 of that total body, total number.
So, but it's that sort of changing our structure piece that does have to be approved. But the language is gone.
Yeah, everything else except for regionalization is done. And in fact, the harmful language stuff and some of the peeling away the prohibitions and the punishment stuff, that work, much of it was made effective immediately. Typically, it's effective starting January 1st following. We changed a lot of it to say, let's do it now. So that was kind of fun. Oh, there's Karen. Yay! Do you want to talk, or here? Yeah, come on up, come on up. I'll just say briefly as you're coming forward, Karen, Dr. Karen Smith is a member of our church, and she was there because she was consecrated as a deaconess in the United Methodist Church. I haven't seen you since Charlotte. I'm glad that you're here. I don't think I've seen you since then.
I don't think I have.
Yeah.
The best part about it is we're getting ready for the ceremony, and it's exciting, and it's sweet, and I turn around, and there's Pastor Taylor. And I was like, you came. She's like, of course I came. I just want to say, as someone who was only there for 4 days and only there for, sort of a different reason, although deaconesses are very involved in polity and advocacy, that the atmosphere was so tranquil and so peaceful. And if you're what was the word, metho nerd?
A metho nerd,
Yeah.
yeah.
We had the first sermon by a publicly avowed practicing metho nerd, who also happens to be a member of the LGBTQIA community. And she did the sermon for our, that particular bishop was lovely for the consecration ceremony. But I want to just let you know, if you're getting excited, that when you mention the word polity, there's a reason that sounds like politics. I was in a breakout session where we were talking about anti-bullying planks, and they spent 10 minutes and 3 motions trying to decide between internet bullying, online bullying, and finally settled on cyberbullying. So if you have the stomach for that type of pace, 10 minutes for that, then please, by all means, get involved. But for metho nerds who can stand that, it was very exciting. I told my husband, give us 7 years and we'll find something to argue about again. But right now, it's really good. So many things were not railroaded through, but the few sessions I sat in, they just kind of slid through. There was a commitment to young people that was evident. There was a commitment to people who have historically been disenfranchised, people of color, people from other continents, women, that was evident. And I think we had quite a few women delegates
Yeah.
this time, yeah. So I just wanted to say it was lovely, it was fun. The only thing I heard, and I heard this from a trustworthy source, but it's hearsay, so it might be something you guys can say more to. I didn't hear of any drama until like early in the second week, my almost next to last day there. I guess some people decided to have a press conference, and it was assumed by the deaconess leadership and deaconess candidates that they were from the Global Methodist Church. But to allow the delegates and the clergy to pass by that, a group of trans and gay people dressed in all their finery made a corridor and just let us walk through peacefully, and that was quite nice. It was beautiful.
We're excited and proud of you, Karen. Thank you. Okay, last question from Will, and then we gotta turn to worship.
Karen mentioned it about historically underserved communities, whether women, minority, racial minorities, sexual orientation, whatever. We also heard that there was a shortcoming in the budget, right? Was there any discussion on how we can start to bring our numbers back up so that we can, for lack of a better term, start to fill those pockets so that we can serve those communities, whatever the community is? Is there any discussion on that?
Well, I will say that there was a lot of care taken to make sure that as we cut the budget, that those communities would feel less of the cut than just the broader church. Does that make sense? You can probably say that better than I can.
Yeah, so like I'm on the Board of Higher Education and Ministry, which serves in leadership for like all of the United Methodist schools, colleges, universities, seminaries, and oversees the ordination process. And so they've known for almost 2 years that they were looking at about a 50% reduction. And because of our commitment to serve historically underserved populations first out of that, the plan that they have moving forward for how they will manage their budget is intended to preserve as much of that as possible. So like the Black College Fund, which is sort of key, stays key and wasn't touched by that funding. We tried as much as we could to have it be in other places, and I think that was true across the board. So it wasn't so much that it was coming off the floor that way, but that there's been care taken up to this point and care continuing to be taken for that.
And then maybe as just a way to kind of wrap things up, I think the sense of the desire, just the sense that this is a new day for the church, that we have ended and the ability of churches to disaffiliate through the pathway that all of these churches have been leaving. We're ready to move forward we are the United Methodist Church. We are excited. We got to hear about all of the incredible ministry that happens all over the world that you don't get to hear every day. And so there was a deep sense of excitement and joy and hope, and not necessarily rooted in and now the church is going to double in size, right? But in a sense of calling to be the church, come what may, right? That God still has work for us to do, and God will take care of us and enable and empower our mission for the future. And so there was just a deep sense of joyful, hopeful moving forward as we were going.
Yeah, a commitment to reflect our values in our leadership and at every level. So for instance, as Pastor Taylor said, in the old days, maybe you would have a badge of honor about how many times you had been on the delegation. I think there's much more of a sense of hoped for and shared commitment that when you do that, you leave out other people. And so you see changes in delegations that I think will continue. I think we got a report that the Council of Bishops has almost as many black women bishops as it has white men for the first time. So, these are all good things that help us be who we hope to be into the future.
Amen.
Thank y'all.
Thanks, y'all.